I've never experienced in my time any quite similar organisation in terms of the capacity to set up opportunities for people to interact in a real way. I mean, it's that sort of truth in communicating with one with another that the NED Foundation was always striven for.
Welcome to another episode of the Social Developers Network podcast. Today we explore the journey of David Purnell, whose story intertwines closely with the vision and legacy of founder of the NED Foundation, Ned Iceton. David was born in Sydney and moved to Canberra as a child straight after World War II. He has spent a lifetime immersed in the evolving social fabric of Australia's capital. His career in public service and leadership roles at the Australian National University during the transformative Whitlam era laid the foundation for a deep commitment to education and societal change. However, it was his involvement with the Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers, that catalysed a global perspective on peace and justice. As clerk of the Friends World Committee, he travelled extensively, advocating for conflict resolution and peace education. His dedication culminated in receiving the Order of Australia Medal, the OAM, in 1998. In the realm of social development, David found resonance with Ned Iceton's visionary approach, leading him to attend the Social Developers Network in the 1980s. Inspired by Iceton's pioneering spirit, he accepted an invitation to join the board of the NED Foundation. So join us today as we delve into David's recollections of Ned Iceton, his experiences with the Social Developers Network from its early days to the present, and his insights into the NED Foundation.
David Purnell from Canberra, and I've been a member of the NED board for a number of years.
David, do you remember first meeting Ned?
Yes, well, Ned was one of those people who came out of the blue for me because I was very interested in adult education stuff, alternatives in the way things were done. So I heard, somebody gave me his name, I forget who was, but he came down from Armidale to visit Canberra, and in those days the Centre for Continuing Education, as it was called, was quite a radical group in the ANU, and he came to give a seminar there, and I was just very impressed by his wide vision about the world, and all the possibilities that we needed to think about in terms of where the world was heading.
Just step us through that a little bit, what those first impressions were and how he presented.
I knew that he had a bit of a reputation. Somebody had said to me, he's a bit of a maverick, and I thought, I'll be interested to hear what he has to say. The thing was that I had been involved for some years in a thing called Australian Frontier. Now that was an offshoot of the Congregational Church in which I grew up. And it was one of these ministers who'd lived in Africa. I mean, he was a Westerner, but he'd lived in Africa, and he'd come back to Australia with the idea of mobilising the church to be a vehicle for interchange between people on current issues. Now, that was fairly radical in those days, The point was that because of my commitment to the church and more radical parts of the church, I was already thinking in terms of the fact that it was a bit sort of stodgy in some ways. But this fellow, whose name was Peter Matthews, his whole approach was to set up an organisation which would facilitate people coming together to talk about issues that affected themselves and the community. And as a result of that, he formed a little panel of people in the ACT, of which I became the sort of little secretary. And the idea was to pick themes, like, you know, what was happening to kids in education. Of course, in Canberra in those days, there were a lot of public servants living in hostels. So, you know, what was happening with people in hostels, you know, things like that. We became avenues for having people come together for a weekend to thrash a few of these things out. So when I heard about Ned, I thought, well, he must be somebody who, you know, speaks the same sort of language, so I'll go and hear him. And that's what I found, that he was a person who was very much talking about that whole idea of getting people together to share their knowledge and understanding of different issues. So I thought, oh, well, I'll keep an eye on this fella.
What did you see?
Yeah, well, I think the point that I saw was because the Centre for Continuing Education itself was also into this kind of thinking. So I went along to some of their stuff, but I kept hearing about the fact that Ned was working, you know, in Armidale. This would have been some years before he set up the actual SDN process. But when I heard that it was being set up, I immediately pricked up my ears and thought, oh, again, you know, I better find out a bit more about this. As it turned out, it was a few years later that I got involved and realised, because I then met someone else, Barbara Hicks, who had been a friend of Ned's, and I'd known her as well. And she said to me, oh, you know, there's this social developers thing developing. And I said, oh, okay. And then eventually she said, well, we're having a workshop up in Armidale. Would you like to come? So I did. And then it turned out that Christine Larkin was also going from Canberra, and I only knew her very vaguely. She was a friend of Barbara's. And I thought, oh, okay, we could travel together because we, you know, in those days save a bit of money. So we travelled up to Armidale by car and got to know each other as well. So in one fell swoop, I got to know Ned in a more realistic way in his workshop, and got to know Chris, and we got together. So yeah, it was a very significant part of my time.
So what was happening at the workshop? Do you remember those early ones?
Yeah, well, I remember that it was Ned in those days had a fairly prearranged kind of formula, which he called a sort of script analysis, where he was talking about people rewriting themselves, if you like, you know, going through what their life was like and re-scripting themselves as to things that they'd like to get into and why and that sort of thing. So it was sort of a self-exploration kind of thing. And that's how the workshop ran, with different people who were prepared to be the sort of guinea pigs to in front of everybody else, work through their script and how it was affecting their lives and so on. And people could ask questions, but it was all done in a very respectful way. And I remember right from the beginning there were these very clear rules, many of which we still have, about respecting people's journey, not being nasty to people in terms of the way you reacted to what they said, or challenging people and in a direct way, you know. So yeah, I found that was really good.
So you stayed with it?
Yes, absolutely. After that, Chris and I went pretty well every year, and in those days it was mainly held in Armidale, so we used to go up there. It was usually in January, so we'd have a bit of free time and holiday period, and we'd head up there, and occasionally we'd go with. I'd separated from my former wife, so my kids had all grown up, and Chris's kids were younger, so we took them with us a few times. And there were some other kids that were there as well, and so they formed their own little group and played together, and occasionally I think they would do little skits along the lines of what they saw us doing, which was very entertaining.
Did you see Ned develop or change in that period?
He and Joan would have got together by that time, and so she kind of was there as a joint facilitator, I suppose you'd say, and she intended to sort of counterbalance some of his more, strong sort of statements about analysing, situations or people's experience. She would sort of modify it a bit when she felt he was getting a bit over the top.
So what would that be like? What was it about Ned that she felt needed a bit of tempering?
Well, I think it was probably a lot of it would have been gender sort of based in a way that he did tend to see himself as a guru, I think, a bit of a guru, and so it would be mainly on her part just deflating him a bit when he got a bit carried away, and certainly, I mean, I can understand that, because I think I could see that he had a fairly clear idea of where he thought people ought to be headed. And so he would push that along quite strongly. And he had little phrases about people looking after, there was one that came out, Big Ned and Little Ned. There was this sort of thing of, are you going to be retreating into your little self, or are you going to be expanding into your potential self, and that kind of thing. So, I mean, I think overall I found it very stimulating. And the workshops were quite long in those days. They were a week long. So people were prepared to make that kind of commitment. And so that meant a lot of these people had, as you said before, they'd been to sort of encounter groups or other things. So they were into a bit of personal growth. And so it was really interesting to be involved in a group like that. And you had some people in the group who were very into sensuality. So Beth Basnett, for example, was the one most likely to say, well, I'm going to run my session by sending you all outside to study the ground or the trees or something, and come back with a story or some kind of message that you've received from nature and draw it, So that was one, and there was more of that kind of what you might call graphic stuff or emotional release type things, rather than just talking and intellectualizing about stuff. So, and as I seem to recall that the sexes were fairly balanced in those days. I don't recall going into any of these workshops where there wasn't a pretty even spread of males and females. So it made for a good balance. And then we had we used to make our own meals and that kind of thing. So Ned would arrange to get the ingredients for meals, and people would then rotate looking after the catering and all that stuff, and the childcare when it was required. So and the other rule that was very unusual in a sense to me was you didn't have to take part in everything. You could leave. You could say to people, I'm sorry, I'm having a session off. I'm going to have a rest, or I'm going to go for a walk, or whatever. And it was accepted that was part of the deal. And I found that was very interesting, because I'd never kind of encountered that sort of stuff in that way. And I think it was a very good idea, really. At the same time, of course, there were, at times, there were sort of emotional scenes, or somebody would get offended by something that had happened. And so there would be, would have to be a sort of debriefing process of some kind. And like all groups, I mean, sometimes that would not happen until the next day, or even 2 days later, after several people on one-to-one basis had been working out with somebody why they felt that way and what was the problem. But I felt all along there was a very strong commitment to listening to other people, and to being resolved that you were going to hang in there while things got sorted out. And And usually that worked out. I think, there were very few occasions on which people basically pulled out or never came back or something like that. I felt that there was an ongoing sort of core of people who continued to come year after year, and on top of that there'd be new people coming in as well. So I think it was a pretty good balance, really.
So that then continued on in that way for some time, and then at some stage there must have been a change.
Yeah, well, sadly, Joan got cancer, and I think she and Ned were only together for about 10 years, actually. And I can remember it was in the mid-90s then, and so she used to come and sort of lie down most of the time during the workshops, and she still tried to contribute, but it was pretty difficult. And so it was very much of a sort of sobering feeling around the place. And so she died in the mid-90s, and I think Ned, that was pretty difficult for Ned. He took a fair while to get over that. I think by then a number of other people were taking a more active role and were having workshops in other places, so we were moving around a bit more and trying different venues and so forth. And that meant that the local people would have more of a role of organising, of catering, getting the food together and all that sort of thing. And also trying to recruit new people in their own area. And so, that went on for a while.
And all through this time, I think it's probably worth mentioning John Russell. What was happening with John?
Yeah, well, John was a very important person in the group, mainly because although he wasn't very vocal, he would always be very concerned about the welfare of the group. And he would almost certainly be the one who would be trying to patch things together or bring people together and confront if there'd been a conflict or something arising. He would be the one who would be insisting that we had to work it through. And so I think he was quite a good foil for Ned in that way. And so John has continued on in the same vein. There was always somebody who had a great concern for the welfare of, having been a social worker, working with the poor and needy and so on at various points of his life, and having had some overseas experience as well. He was always very level-headed, I think, in terms of the sort of issues he would want to raise and questions he would like to ask people if somebody was making a presentation. John would always have a good question to put in to follow through and so on. So, so he was another very important part of the whole scene, yeah.
So then we moved to the next stage.
Yeah, well, by that time, I think Ned was beginning to feel that he was very committed to continuing to challenge the status quo, if you like, and put in place procedures and structures that would make things more satisfactory in terms of human development and so on. And so he was starting to think of how this could be continued on when he was no longer around. And he, partly I think because he'd had a fairly well-to-do background, and he had inherited quite a bit of money, and he'd worked as a doctor and so forth, and his needs were not very great, and so he'd accumulated quite a bit of investments and that sort of thing. He got this idea of some kind of foundation or something to carry on what he was doing. And so that was when the board was sort of set up and put on a more sound footing, incorporated as an association and all that sort of thing. And a group of people that he trusted were brought in as board members. And so then it became a matter of that then kind of moved it into a slightly more formal arrangement, so that the board was then separate from the workshops. And so the workshops were then seen as a point of entry, if you like, for people coming into the network. And all the people on the board had been to workshops, and that was one of the sort of symbols that you were eligible to be on the board, that you had had some experience of the workshops. And so that was the way it was set up. And although it still was fairly participatory in terms of the workshops themselves would have a kind of business meeting and would actually kind of choose people who were going to help run the future workshops and things like that. So there was a bit of that formality, if you like, but most of the business side of things was then put onto the board. And then, of course, we had to find ways to make sure the money that Ned was investing was going to be used in an ethical way. And those were the days when people were starting to say, well, ethical investment is the thing to have. We've got to not invest in some of these traditional companies which are ripping people off or not, creating environmental damage and that sort of thing. So, and that's when Damien Lynch came on because of his background in Australian ethical investment, and he became an important advisor. And also it's the time when Michael Marr started taking a more active day-to-day role, working with Ned in Armidale to regularise the way things were done, to devise more policies that were written down and clarified. And so from then on, Ned's role was more as he still did a lot of work in terms of networking. He loved to expound on things in written as well as verbal form, and he loved sending messages to all sorts of people on the network. And so it would be very common to several times a month for you to receive a long email from Ned that he'd sent to all the people on the list, giving his latest update analysis of where the world was heading and all that kind of thing. And that was always, sometimes it was a bit overwhelming, to have to try and absorb all this stuff and try and respond to it. But anyway, the board was having a board meant that you did have slightly more frequent meetings than just once a year workshops. And the board then began to grapple with some of these issues a bit more formally. And eventually that led to the development of smaller segments like we've now got with the working groups and with the issues like restorative practice and so forth, which Ned became very interested in. He was also very much into cooperatives. That was one he was madly excited by. Mongadon, or whatever it was called, is that what the name of it? In Spain, the cooperatives movement that had developed there. He visited there and he thought, this was a great example of a good structure of community engagement in business and so on. So he used to spend quite a lot of time promoting that whole idea. So I guess you could say that his legacy was being shaped by all this, because he was still involved, very active, but he also had more people now committed to the whole idea of community development and so forth.
So then, continuing on, was he ill before he died, or what happened?
He had a few bouts of illness, but and he got a pacemaker at one stage. So I think what most of us probably didn't realise was that he was actually probably less well than we were made to think at the time. There seems to be, I think he was sort of keeping that a little bit under wraps, but probably Michael knew something more than the rest of us, seeing him more often. But mainly, I mean, he still, he was still attending the workshops regularly. He was still on the board and still bringing up his ideas about change and so forth, and doing his little bits of lobbying when he could. And then that went right. Well, that went on pretty much till not long before he died. Really, he did keep coming to pretty well everything. And then at the end, he in 2015 he deteriorated fairly rapidly, and remember we were able to come up and visit him, but he was already in hospital by then, and he wasn't particularly conscious. I mean, he was aware that we were there, but he wasn't able to communicate much, so that was very sad. So then when he died, there was quite a good gathering of people to acknowledge what he'd done and to vow to continue on with the NED network and everything. So since then, which is now 9 years ago, I think his legacy has been pretty remarkably well maintained by all the work that's been put in by the board, and with more people becoming involved in the working groups and so forth. It's sort of meant that the workshops have been able to keep going. There have been some regional workshops as well. The restorative practice group has now got its own coordinator, and the projects, we started giving grants, seed money initially, and that's developed so well with Leslie Shuttleworth and the work that she's done, which has expanded all that so effectively, I think, to the point now where I think it's becoming very much more relevant to current priorities of Indigenous rights, of social challenges around poverty and inequality, environmental justice, and all the rest of it. So I think Ned would be very pleased with that. There were always things like emotional intelligence that used to exercise him a lot, and he used to always say, "I've got to run a workshop on that," and he never was able to bring it together. But I think again the whole idea of a themed workshop, such as we've just had on restorative practice, I think he would have, if he'd done one on emotional justice, emotional intelligence, that would have been an example of that anyway. So
slight change of flavour then, from when he was sort of very much directing, and then at some stage derived from the people who were present in the group.
Yeah, definitely. That was
just talk us through that.
Yeah, well, I would say that it was reflecting the times, particularly the women who came onto the board and so forth, became involved more in some of the running of the workshops and things. They were particularly assertive and in ensuring that Ned wasn't just able to ignore some of the current issues around gender and so on, and so that led to a few confrontations in a way, but it was all kind of worked through, and most of those people still hung around even if they thought he was being a bit old-fashioned in some ways. So I'd say it became, yes, what you're saying, more egalitarian in the way the processes were run, and people felt freer to raise the points that they felt needed addressing. So that to me has been one of the good things that's happened. And I think we've still got further to go with that too. We still haven't quite worked out succession planning and things like that with the board to renew it when most of us are getting older and, can't keep up the same pace as we used to.
Do you have particular memories of Ned?
I think I always felt that Ned was kept up to date remarkably well in a general sense of his awareness of global sort of trends and things like that. I think he was someone who absorbed a lot of information very effectively, and although now reading some of his material seems a bit convoluted, I think he really was nevertheless shaping up some pretty significant issues around global, well, he was onto things like global warming and stuff around his whole concern about restorative work meant that he learnt a lot more from people on the ground who were working in that area, and he became he went out of his way to find out what was happening in different parts of the world and then seeing how it could be applied here and so forth. So to me, he was always alert to these sort of things that were going on. And so I personally always found that I could always relate to what he was saying and could build off that, could be stimulated by that.
I gather he had a view about the impending crisis.
Well, it's interesting. I think he would have, I can think of a couple of other people now, nothing to do with Ned, but who have a very gloomy picture of the future. And you could say that Ned had a bit of a foreshadowing of that sort of attitude, which wasn't particularly common in most of the time he was alive. Most people would have rejected that kind of pessimism, I suppose. But nevertheless, I think it was from my point of view, it was a healthy reminder that we couldn't take things for granted and that we needed to be prepared to stick our necks out a little bit more and experiment with understanding what are the trends and how do we respond to them in a creative way. So, yeah.
So he wasn't frightened of those, but was really ready to take it up to the wire, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And he had a very strong commitment to meditation and all this kind of thing. So he had a very ordered sort of existence as a single person after Joan died, for example. And that probably was a big help to him, I think. He used to talk quite a bit about the importance of his reflection time and getting away from the day-to-day anxieties and trying to sort of recenter himself and that sort of thing. And I could relate to that because I found that was, in my involvement with Quakers, I found the same kind of priority to given to reflection and meditative sort of approaches to things, so forth. Yeah, good.
So would you say you were close to Ned? Was it a friendship, or what was the nature?
Yeah, good question. I think I would say he was a pretty important mentor for me. I think there aren't too many people I can think of that I'd say that about. I think that's probably right. And I think I guess I have to be realistic about the fact that it probably was because he was a male and I was a male, and we both had some common kind of sense of men having a responsibility for making things happen. And that appealed to me in Ned. And I think I did find it quite inspiring to be connected with him for such a long time,
Did that become part of Ned, the Inc. DNA, this sort of responsibility to respond, to be active, to...
Yeah, I think it did, actually.
So tell us about that.
Yes, I would say the people who Well, for example, most of the people who were appointed by Ned to the board originally are still around, have stuck to it, and have been very committed to making it work. And so I think he did imbue us all with a sense that it was important stuff to be involved in, and that we had a responsibility to not just sit on our hands, and just sort of, we needed to find fresh fields to explore. And I think it's really encouraging that that's what has been happening. It's not always been straightforward or up in a straight line or anything, but I think the fact that we now have these different elements of the NED network mean it's more flexible. It's more willing to try things out, and the board has generally been open to keeping things moving in that way, and welcoming other sort of opportunities and putting money into it where it's needed.
Has the world changed much in that time, or has there been a reorientation?
I mean, the sort of stuff we've been talking about even this time together indicates that we are all challenged by some pretty dramatic kind of shifts in the dynamics of the world, and it does appear to have become a much less friendly place in many ways. So I reckon we're all going to be striving to work out how to make sense of all that, and still keep flying the flag for more open communication and trust, willingness to listen more carefully and address some of those long-standing issues in the Australian case, particularly the history of the Indigenous people in this country, and the need for decolonising, our whole sort of mentality and everything like that. Yeah, I think it is more. In some ways, I can see that it's more difficult. Having worked as a mediator for a long time, I can see now that creating space for people to talk to each other and listen to each other is quite difficult. There's a reluctance often for people to let down the barriers because they're feeling a little bit threatened or into a survival mode or something like that.
So finally then, given the changes in the world, what would you say are the enduring qualities that he expressed that make his memory and his legacy so relevant today?
Well, I think all through he was always clear that it was a mixture of personal and social change that we had to be aware of, that you couldn't have one without the other, that they were inextricably linked. And so I think that's continued as definitely a legacy of him. There's never been any other, well, maybe it shows some limitation on my part, but I've never experienced in my time any quite similar organisation in terms of the capacity to set up opportunities for people to interact in a real way. I mean, authentically is the phrase that people tend to use now, which is a bit corny in some ways, but I think it's right. It's that sort of truth in communicating with another that the NED Foundation was always striven for, and I think generally has been pretty good at. I mean, again, if I just take what we did at this recent restorative practice workshop, to me it was just a familiar story where some of us, of course, have been involved for a while. Half the people there had not been involved with the NED directly. And so just to see the way putting people in that environment with an open agenda. I mean, it's themed, but it's still open because it's still about what, you know, where you're coming from, what you want to learn from each other. It just creates so much more of a sense of togetherness, of revelation, I suppose you could say, from one another. And I just find that really impressive.
It's been great talking with you, David. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Is there anything else that you would like to say?
No, I think I'm just delighted that, you know, there's a good opportunity to be able to do this kind of reflection, and hopefully it adds to the mix of how we make the whole enterprise more well known.
Thanks once again.
Thank you.
Today we've journeyed through David's remarkable life and contributions. His story embodies a deep-seated commitment to peace, justice and community development. Join us next time as we continue this series to explore the stories and insights of the founding members of the NED Foundation, shaping our communities for a brighter future. Thank you for listening to Social Developers Network podcast.